Thank you all so much for joining. This is amazing turnouts. We've got a really good group of people spanning the entire age range from K-3 up to lifelong learning. not the people themselves, where they work. And so what I want to do is just get started with the obvious question that comes up in every single one of these panels, which is, we know automation is going to spread. We know that's going to change things about jobs. And so what does that mean for education? And the things I think are interesting here that I want to focus on are, is it going to be predictable? And what does that mean for how we prepare our kids? So I'm just going to open it up.
I'll start by saying it's not going to be predictable. Whenever there's a technology jump, there's always unexplained side effects. So just one of my favorite examples is when the train was invented. Everyone said, oh, the horse is going away. There'll be no more horses because we'll have trains. But what actually happened with trains is they replaced the place where people would go at the day-to-day inn, where it was a horse ride apart. But where they needed horses was to get the luggage from the train to the hotel. There's a whole new ecosystem of how people moved, and it actually required more horses in the beginning. I think these kind of stories, we got to remember that we don't understand the changes that we're making technologically, and we don't understand the side effects. So I'd say unpredictable.
Yeah, I'll just, sure. John, you want to go?
Sure, I'm John Behrens. I'm the Vice President of AI Product Development at Pearson.
Yeah, I'm Mark Angel. I'm the CEO of Amira Learning and formerly the Chief Technology Officer at Renaissance Learning.
I'm Emily Sands. I lead data science and data engineering at Coursera.
I'm Angela Baum, the head of Silicon Valley R&D Center at TL Education Group.
And I'm Sean Fahey. I lead the data science team at 2U.
Yeah, so my comment on what John said is that anytime you go through a sea change, there's going to be massive unexpected consequences. On the other side, we've been through 40 years now of seeing the impact of automation on employment and on human labor. And what we know is the obvious, that with each increment of automation, the bar rises in terms of what people are left to do. And AI is going to make a tremendous jump in that respect. So what we know almost for certain is that as AI enters the world in more and more profound ways, that the things that will be left to people will require more of those special skills that are unique to people around emotional capacity, EQ, around creativity, around being able to make logical connections between disparate sources of knowledge, and about being able to really handle the kinds of jobs that are already going to begging in the world.
And I think on this question of how do you prepare for that, in my mind, adaptation is the one thing that we know we want people to be able to do. We can't predict the changes. We know changes are coming. Jobs that were stable and were good jobs are going to go away. Jobs that we've never heard of and have no idea what the job description of are going to come in the future. And so the best thing that we can do for our kids or for any future generation is to make sure that they, first of all, accept change as inevitable. It's not something we can fight against. It's not something where we can go back to an era where you can assume things are going to stay status quo. And then the more we can invest in truly fundamental education and get people used to the idea of lifelong learning, as the lunch speakers talked about, the idea of one and done, that you're going to somehow finish a bachelor's or master's in your 20s and then be done with learning for your life, that era is done. You got to get used to the idea that we're all going to be going back to school frequently of different types, whether it's a course, a degree, a certificate. We're going to be continuously relearning in order to be ready for those jobs.
So when I think about AI coming to education, I always think that the nature of the job of teaching has always been changing with or without AI. Today we're already learning so many things from sources that are teacherless. And also our request to personalize and make things precise for everything also requires more than teachers would traditionally do in the classroom. So I'll give one example. It's not like unpredictable, but if you know how to cope with technology, a lot of things we can harness that in direction. Like in an English classroom in China, if you have like 20 or 25 kids, which is about the average class group in China, if you have 20 kids all pronounce apple, it's impossible for a human teacher to tell, oh, which kid is not pronouncing I in apple correctly. But with a very simple technology, a very simple piece of machine learning embedded in the clicker, the AI can do the pronunciation recognition job for the teachers, and we train them to learn how to use this technology in the classrooms. But I don't personally see that happening in here, so I think it's something more interesting, more thought-provoking than unpredictable is what we are seeing is happening actually otherwise. Yeah.
So what I heard there was one way that AI will transform education is it changes what we need to teach our students. A little loud here. Another way that, what I also just heard that will transform it is who's doing the teaching? Is AI's job to help the teacher teach? Or is it to teach for them? Or is it going to be a mix of them? And that's sort of essentially what you're getting at a little bit there, Angela, but we'd love to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so we think about this in a very pragmatic manners, right? So AI, we see more as tools and the solutions that leave the burdens of the teachers in their teaching functions. The average teacher-student ratio in China is about 17, but learning science theory informs us that our working memory can hold about 5 to 7 objects at the same time. You cannot really think or process more information blocks than that. But in a class with 20 students, how do you do that? Especially right now when kids need more personal attention in math coaching, English pronunciation, we have this simple technology to help teachers to do the function so that teachers can, their time can be freed up to focus on more complex skills like collaborative problem solving, like telling narratives about actual characters to help help students to visualize information. Those more complex skills that cannot be easily displaced by AI in the future. So that's how I personally say this, AI helping teachers, facilitating them to be a better teacher at this time.
Yeah, so the space that has the longest and deepest experience with AI is manufacturing, and they've evolved towards the concept of a cobot, basically the notion that smart technology needs to coexist with a human and the people on the factory floor. And if the model in a relatively simple environment like the factory works best with a collaborative approach, how much more for the classroom with all its complexities? Absolutely.
And I think we see across industries that AI tends to automate portions of work, tasks within jobs, but not entire jobs themselves. And I think we're seeing the same in teaching. For example, in the Coursera context, AI can help students find the right content to reach their goals, but there's still room for a counselor, for example, to help students make really high-stakes decisions. Or AI can predict when students need additional support and serve them automated triggered interventions to get them back on track in many cases. But in a small number of cases, it requires more involved human judgment. And so I think, just as in a range of industries, AI isn't automating whole jobs, it's automating tasks and leaving what is innately unique to humans, that judgment piece for the humans to do. I think we're seeing the same thing in the teaching context.
So Mark, you mentioned manufacturing, for example, is often on the cutting edge of this. Do you think education is behind the curve when it comes to transformation through AI, and why?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that education behind that can't be a controversial position. I think there's probably a good, a bad, and an ugly reason why that's true. The good reason is that educators are naturally hesitant to treat students as experiments. And it's a heck of a lot easier to roll the dice in some other verticals and some other spaces. And rightly, we need a lot of proof points before we're willing to put technology and programs in front of kids. I think the bad reason that we're behind in AI is that up until very recently, the kind of compelling applications that are really game-changing, driven by AI, haven't existed. You go to Wall Street, and if AI can make better trades, well, it's sure going to get onto the trading floor in a nanosecond. And we haven't yet seen those kinds of killer apps until recently. The ugly reason is that we lack the infrastructure. We still go to Mirror, we still go to large urban schools where we have to provide the hardware and where the internet connectivity is a struggle. And for sure, AI applications tend to be hungry for infrastructure.
I think there is a fun counter argument here, though, which is that most of the AI that has been generated, whether it's algorithms that are now out in Python or R packages or companies that are here today, have their basis usually in some research lab, in some PhD study. So on one hand, the foundations of AI globally are in fact anchored in education, which is why your answer is right on and so ironic. That when I was for a while working at Johns Hopkins leading the data efforts there, I would be walking to one building and seeing haptic feedback where they were getting expert surgeons to record activities and then use it as a training simulation so that you could help new surgeons understand how to do suturing. And then literally I would walk back and have conversations about how to get paper records out of file cabinets, about how to migrate some database from Access to anything else, right? And so you have this really interesting dichotomy between cutting edge technology on one hand, but it hasn't gotten into the business, at least in higher ed, which is where my current experience is. Yeah. The business of education definitely has room for improvement.
Yeah,
well, I'm kind of happy it hasn't gotten too far along from a certain perspective, which is we need to think clearly about what we mean when we say education. So do we mean K to 4? Do we mean 4 to 10? Do we mean graduate school? In those different situations, there's different risk profiles for how people interact with machines. There's also a different need profile in terms of human need versus machine interaction and what's appropriate in the ecosystem. So I think education is conservative, especially in the younger ages. I think the real opportunity, and we're going to see a lot of, and we have seen most of the work happen in higher ed, not only because of the risk profile is different, people are adults, they can manage their interactions, and the emotional need is lower. So machines in the factory, it's great, they're going to generate data and they're not going to have any emotional needs. However, in education, most of the individuals right now generate a lot less data, and the younger they get have stronger emotional needs. So we have to balance out, what do we mean by education? What do we mean by learning? I tell my data science teams, no one's ever stayed in college because a machine told them they believe in them. And that's why many people do stay in college.
I think an obvious barrier is that a lot of education is still happening offline, and in terms of you gather data, clean data, get data back in the feedback loop, that takes a much longer cycle than e-commerce or online trading or stuff like that. For TL, for example, like we have, I'm just using TAL as an example. We have over 11,000 physical classrooms in China, and all of them were pretty traditional classrooms, or we didn't have like smart sensors and stuff. And how do you gather the data from the process of class? There's no way for you to do that, and you cannot really like swipe right, swipe left at the end of the class to say, oh, this is a good class or a bad class. You have to go through evaluation programs with the students, the teachers, and the stuff. But right now we started deploying smart sensors, of course, with the local principals and parents' permission, to digitize the process of the classes. Like how many times the students have interacted with the teachers, how many times they have raised their hands, how many times they have answered a question, stuff like that. So to get into this black box of brick and mortar classroom a little bit as a starting point, but that takes much longer time than if you are a digital native business.
So going off what you just said, it seems often that progress and privacy and kind of controls around data often are at odds with each other. And it seems like this may be true in education. Does it have to be? Are there regional differences potentially in that as well? And what does that mean?
I don't think they have to be at odds. I mean, at core, privacy protection has to be about transparency and trust. We have to tell users, this is what we're collecting, this is why we're collecting it, this is how we're going to use it. So that's the transparency part. And then the trust is you have to do that. And I think we've seen examples, for example, in the medical sphere, where we've had decades of great research with very, very sensitive data, but it's because there's a very clear understanding between those who are providing the data and the researchers who are using it about the ethical uses of data and who should benefit from that. So I don't think they have to coexist, even though that's certainly the current dialogue in the country.
Yeah, I completely agree, and your comparison to the medical world is right on point, in that the starting point for a dynamic around privacy that's sensible is a better agreement between the owners of data and the users of data than we have today in education. I think we often veer between oversensitivity, the kind of nightmarish fears that paralyze people from wanting to share data, to naivete on the other side, where people commit to sharing data without the proper controls and imposition on the part of vendors or data science teams that are using it. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that there's some unsolved problems within the data science pipeline. We see this all the time, and there's only 3 ways you can really make data private. You can obfuscate it, you can generalize it, you can randomize it, and all those things have troubles in the context of really working with educational data effectively. So I know at Amira we're very hungry to get better tools and better solutions in this regard than we've got today.
I'll probably offer some thoughts from outside America, because I'm the only one here, not originally from here. Again, I mean, a lot of Chinese parents, they see AI or the benefits of technology for their kids in a very pragmatic manner. Like if you ask parents from the low-cost geographies in China if they mind sharing their kids' process, speech or whatever data to the company in exchange for better English coaching, the parents will say yes. And then if you ask if you worry about privacy and stuff, it's like asking hungry people if you care white rice doesn't have enough fiber.
Yeah.
So along the same lines, another thing that often helps speed up the development of AI is having that centralization of data. And whenever you're talking about centralization, there's always concern that that leads to kind of either too much in one place or essentially a small number of winners in the space. Is that something that we should be concerned about here? And might there be differences across higher ed, K-12, foreign, domestic, et cetera? Like, is that something we should be concerned about?
So in the context of higher ed, I don't think we'll see centralization of particular big winners that are educational institutions in the near term. And I think there are probably 2 reasons for that. The first is that learners value different types of higher education. There are geographic preferences, there are language preferences, there are brand or domain preferences that means that there's actually demand for heterogeneity in the market. But the second reason, which I think is probably more important, is that people get education for 2 reasons. One is to develop skills or human capital, but the second is to develop a signal, to be able to credibly signal those skills in the labor market. And there's an inherent tension between technology's potential to scale up human capital development with the need to keep it exclusive and highly selective so that they can retain the signal. And so I don't think we're going to see, at least in higher ed, a lot of centralization of individual institutions, or therefore centralization of data at individual institutions. Where I do think we might see centralization is in a couple of platforms. So to the extent that platforms, Coursera may be one, 2U may be another, are able to bring together different educational providers, let those providers still have a selective signal, but across a wide range of providers serve a wide range of learners. I think that'll be the data that'll unlock new AI applications. That'll be the place where data can be centralized, and it's sort of in the platform model where we've seen a lot of the innovations in AI outside of the education sector. So I'd be excited to see the same thing for the educational context.
And I think building on that, the idea of not only being able to have these larger sets that you could study, but also retain the point that a university, if they choose to contribute and participate in one of these consortia, can actually gain benefit from understanding, here is my data, but now I have a broader understanding of the context that that data is in. So the Research One universities in the US, the AAU, they've had different forms of data sharing for a long time, but usually it's been at sort of survey and people speed. And I think the opportunities to have new standards, new data exchange mechanisms so that we can actually, hopefully, to your point, and this is, I will say admittedly, the optimistic view of it, is to figure out, can we get the benefit of scale while still maintaining universities and students being able to maintain control over their own data?
Yeah, if you look at every other part of the world, the ability to aggregate data has led inexorably to centralization and to a relatively small number of platforms becoming dominant. There are incredible barriers that have built up over decades in both higher ed and K-12 that you can see as potentially mitigating that effect. But in a world where 60% of the doctorate level data scientists work for 4 companies. There's also some good reasons to believe that we're going to see a lot more centralization as the power of data becomes more central to education.
I would echo that, in the K-12 after-school learning market especially, which is huge in Asia, because the open data sets about K-12 students, their signals whatsoever are so limited, chances are that those data will be created from within the walls of our own classrooms. And also same for other large companies in India and also in China, and then we'll harness the benefits of data firsthand to do the AI training and stuff like that, from within. But there's one scenario that if the larger companies would open source their data sets or models or other APIs in the sense of building an educational version of AWS, then the smaller companies can probably build off their own tools from the larger companies' open data sets and also models. So in that sense, larger company will be setting the industry standards and the frameworks. But I suspect the data powerhouse will still be lying with the larger ones in the K-12 space.
So we spent most of the time so far really talking about some of the challenges of getting AI to where we want it to be in education. I'm going to get to a little bit more optimistic part after this next question. And for the next question, I'm going to go in totally opposite direction still of, are there areas where AI can actually directly harm education? And where I'm going with this is we're kind of in this era of increasing misinformation. And AI is also helping develop sort of false assets like fake images, fake videos. It's harder and harder to tell the difference between what's real and what's fake. What does that mean for education? Might we see fake students, for example? Just kind of want to hear some thoughts on that topic.
So I think, are we going to see fakes? Absolutely, right? They exist today. They exist whether it's students, whether it's videos, whether it's audio, whether it's images. They're good and they're getting better, right? So I think on the pragmatic side, anybody who is in the business of accrediting that a learner has learned something has an obligation to make sure that the learner that they're accrediting really was that person. So what I hope, though, and again, to spin back towards optimism, even with AI being able to generate these things, I think education writ large is really the way that we save ourselves from it. We need to teach people to be critical thinkers. You don't need a highly trained AI to generate a fake video to throw off large parts of the country, right? We have a measles outbreak right now that's a result of ignorance, of misinterpreting fundamental science, and then propagating that despite all evidence to the contrary, right? So that's not a case where it took AI to cause the problem, but it is something where with proper education, with proper understanding of public health, with proper messaging, we actually can use education to help combat what is a errant signal in the system.
Yeah, I think there's probably a really straightforward precedent around this particular issue. If you look in the network security and financial world, software has gotten smarter in terms of the things that hackers deploy and the things that the bad guys deploy. On the flip side, what's been the response to that? Companies have arisen that use AI and smarter technology to combat that negative potential. And the way this has turned it in, right? Your company, whenever you start to get cheating and you start to get people circumventing a system, you can invent the counter spy, the alternative kind of approach that combats that. And I think that'll be what plays out. We'll continue to see more and more fugazis in the world, and then we'll continue to evolve better tools to spot and detect those fakes and root them out of the system.
One area where I'm optimistic is if we think about this idea that we often say that the AI will free teachers and students up to do more and more of the things that computers can't do, then those are new kinds of experiences and interactions. So for instance, instead of maybe having a task which is interpret this poem, which an AI can learn because we have thousands of students interpreting that poem, that's one story. But if we have gained the time to the instructor and to the educational ecosystem to change that task from a blanket, everyone does this, to interpret this poem from the perspective of your life experiences and your family, Well, now it's both harder to replicate, but also a richer task and a richer interaction of the kinds of things that we want our students and our teachers to be involved in. So again, as we create these new AI capabilities, it will open the opportunity for different kinds of interactions, and that's where we're going to see a shift toward making it harder and harder to follow that, to the degree that we bring more and more of the enabling of the human through the AI.
Yeah, I think the production of those new interactions in terms of the way of learning and also the content will be a huge new challenge for both schools and also the larger companies. Like right now still, I mean, I see a dramatic difference between Chinese math and also US math. Like in Chinese math, this time, they still have a huge focus on math calculation and on computing, and everything is formula-based. Like why in the era of AI and computers where the machines can do a much better job than human brains, we still have the kids memorize all the formulas? Why can't they just bring a cheat sheet or bring a Google if they know how to work with Google and type? Because they will not be required to calculate by formula after they get into the job market. But what other content do we have to teach the new math to kids? Like what are the responsibility for larger companies or for the schools? That's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I think that's another lesson of the technology revolutions is whenever there's new technologies, the first thing we do is we do the old things with the new technologies, and it takes a while to start rethinking.
Yeah.
So there's real opportunity there.
So going back to what you said a little bit earlier, Emily, we've been talking a lot about how we help students learn what they need to learn. But the other piece of it is that signal. How do they prove that they are where they need to be? It'd be great to hear some thoughts on how AI can help provide that signal in a more scalable way, potentially.
Yeah, so I think as we think about traditional credentials in the labor market, it's things like where did you go to college, or what companies have you worked at, or who's part of your social network. And those credentials do signal people's productivity in the labor market, but more so in a world where it's kind of learn, do, retire, and the learning that happened at the beginning of life is the strongest signal of how productive you'll be. And in this new world where people need to learn throughout life, we also need new ways to signal that productivity in the labor market. And I think without that, one, the labor market's not going to be particularly efficient. Two, we're going to have serious issues around social mobility. And three, if you sort of step back, people will say, oh, I could learn throughout life, but if I can't signal what I've learned, if I can't be rewarded for what I've learned, why would I bother going out to learn? So actually incentivizing individuals to learn is challenging. And so what can data do? This is early days. I don't have a final solution. I think one approach is to build bottoms-up, skills-based credentials. So on Coursera, for example, we have tens of millions of assessments that are attempted by learners every year. We know a lot about those learners, including what roles they're in, at what companies, and you can actually train models to back out, okay, what skills are being assessed by this question, and at what difficulty level is it assessing that skill? And then looking across millions of learners and tens of millions of assessments, you can start to back out each individual's skill profile in each of a range of skills. And I think so far we primarily worked with our about 2,000 enterprise customers to provide those skill-based signals so that they can reward internal talent for what they know. So, okay, which of my back-end software engineers has strong math foundations and might be well-positioned to transition to machine learning, or help me identify talent among remote workforces. But they're also in pilot starting to use that to identify external talent. So for example, among Coursera's learner base, many of whom do not have standard credentials and would not make it through a recruiter's resume screen, who actually has the skill profile to be successful at my company. And so, that's just one example of a solution. I hope that there are many such solutions, but the basic premise is the traditional credentials aren't sufficient in this new world where people need to be learning throughout life. We need to come up with more skills-based credentials. Skills is the currency of the labor market, both for the efficiency of that market and for social mobility, and to incentivize that lifelong learning. And so I hope many more such solutions start to pop up. And I think employers are hungry enough for talent and recognize that just going off traditional credentials is too expensive, right? When 60% of your PhD data scientists are at 4 companies. And so I do think sort of now is a moment when we can see that shift, but it'll take thought and care.
Yeah, look, assessment has to be one of the really core opportunities for AI in education. All the things that are great about people, the fact that they care, the fact that we're variable, the fact that we make a lot of judgments instantaneously. Those are the kiss of death things when it comes to accreditation and certification. AI really has the potential, both in education and other areas, to take direct aim at where bias and decision-making that really isn't powered by data has negative consequences. So I think that maybe for the first time we can get to technology that is smart enough that it's believable enough to the people who make hiring and decisions, and therefore the signaling will be good.
I think if we ignore education and we just try to solve it within recruiting or within talent development, we're going to end up basically reinforcing the same human biases that already exist. You can train a great AI to figure out which resumes are good resumes
Human
based
recruiter
on what,
thinks good,
how
yeah.
recruiters have engaged with it in the past. But if you actually get one level deeper and understand what are the inherent skill profiles of people and what skill profiles are required to be effective in the job, you can start to get out of that vicious cycle of sort of biased AI trained on biased humans.
And I think that brings up the importance of, for most of education, the longitudinal data sets. So whether we're at the higher education side producing people in the postgraduate labor markets, or whether there's undergraduate institutions trying to figure out who makes a good graduate student, or whether there's high schoolers trying to figure out who makes for a good college student, finding ways that we can effectively tie data so that we're using real outcomes, so that at each of those levels we're targeting on what is the next outcome, exactly to your point, so that we're not training on a biased sample, or we're not training on our presumption of success, but we're actually using the appropriate goalposts all the way along.
Your team can probably track students coming from our K-12 to the US colleges.
Yeah, I think this is, and this area of assessment is an interesting area for education, because often people think, well, education, you know, the examples I was giving about K-12 and the high need for emotion and touch, which is certainly true, but there's also a long history in education around educational assessment and around placement and around describing the strengths and weaknesses, knowledge, skills, and attributes of learners. And in that, there's actually, you know, legal precedent around bias and not having bias in educational assessment. Some of the things that just pop up like, oh, bias, and we never thought of that before. Well, some parts of the industry, we've been thinking about it for 100 years, and there's legal precedent, and there's statistical precedent, and there's a lot to be learned from standard practice in some of those areas.
I'm going to ask just one last open-ended question, and if we have a couple of minutes at the end for questions from you all, that'd be great. Just for each of you, what are you most excited about, both in your own roles and more broadly, just related to this topic?
I'll go first because it's fast. You may have been able to tell because I started speaking very quickly. I'm very excited about creating new bottoms-up skills-based credentials that create more equality of opportunity in the labor market. Equality of access to education is not enough. People actually have to be rewarded for that learning, and I think there's a lot that AI and data science can do in that space.
I'm really excited about turning the high quality personal education just like the tap water for people. Whenever you turn on the tap, you can get it. Right now with 5G being piloted, with the hardware sensors becoming so inexpensive, with content that we can produce massively from the human teachers to the AI recommendation engines, I think that is really coming up.
I'm excited about the idea of new ways to teach in the digital environment. To your point about every technology, the first thing we do is we apply it as we did before. So TV comes out and the first advertisements are people reading radio scripts in front of a camera. I think we're still at that era right now in how we're using the digital medium, and I'm excited to figure out, as we get more simulations, more games, more interactive activities, what new and exciting things we're going to be able to do with education that's very different and very exciting.
Yeah, so excited about the potential for AI to finally do something about our equity issues. We've got the same fourth grade NAEP scores today that we had 30 years ago, and what we see is that 2/3 of our children are not proficient readers by the time they're 9 or 10 years old. We have the opportunity, I think, thanks to smarter and smarter technology, to really bring the Bloom effect and the idea that if every kid has a individualized tutor, you get a 2 sigma growth to life with AI.
I'm most excited about, kind of along the lines that Seth was saying, I'm most excited about bringing richness back into scale. So in many contexts, what we've done in the last 30 years through technology is to get scale, we've simplified the tasks we have people do. We've sat them down in front of computers and given them multiple choice tests, or we've simplified things on paper and pencil to scale. But with AI, the possibility is that we can give rich interactions, simulations and games, complex work examples, movies and dances, and those can all be scaled through the AI support. So rather than simplifying education so we can scale, AI gives us the possibility, it's my hope and belief, gives us the possibility to scale with richness.
Awesome, thank you all. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. If you have, there's one right there.
Yes. Hi, my name is Marta Hernandez, and I'm actually really excited about what I just heard. Earlier, as I was grabbing lunch, I was asked twice when food was coming. And so going back into bias, I teach unbiased and privileged training. And in my last training, I asked a group of 40 construction workers how many of them felt like school was for them. And no one raised their hand. And the answer was, this is why I'm in construction. And to go back into thinking that bottoms-up skill-based learning is essentially where we're leading, particularly given where the economics and the demographics of this country are headed, that I'm really excited about that. But my question is around culture and identifying specifically people who have been traditionally in survival. How do you support those individuals to understand learning differently than it was presented to them back then when I have to sit and watch you teach something to me?
First of all, I'm sorry that somebody asked you when the food was coming.
Okay.
People constantly think I'm a recruiter, not a hiring manager, so I'm with you. I don't know that there is a one-size-fits-all or easy solution. But I think that reaching people where they are with the message they need to hear is actually something that AI is uniquely positioned to do, right? So people on stage have been alluding to the fact that, like, the first movie was filming a play on stage, and the first MOOC was filming an instructor in the classroom. And there's a whole set of things that this new medium allows us to do beyond just scale that we haven't yet fully realized. And I think one of those is personalized, just-in-time nudges and interventions to support people and get them back on track. And some of those are pedagogical, recommending the right review material, et cetera, but many of them are behavioral. So emphasizing how it does align with their personal goals, or social proof that people like them have been successful in this domain. And we have an adaptive intervention system on Coursera where we see very heterogeneous treatment effects for those types of nudges. They work really well for some people, much more so than others. In particular, they work really well for people from traditionally disadvantaged backgrounds, just telling them that people like them have been successful in the domain. So I don't think that there's going to be a single panacea that's going to solve it, but I do think that AI has a potential for us to reach people with the individualized messages that they need, and to learn over time what are the messages that they need. Now, in doing that, we need to be thoughtful. We need to be thoughtful that we're not assuming someone needs social proof just because they're from a disadvantaged background, and there needs to be sort of that explore arm in addition to the exploit arm. So constantly training the models with fresh and unbiased data. But I think there's a ton of potential for AI to at least make progress in that direction. I think that the people building the AI need to be themselves diverse and from diverse backgrounds in order to ideate and come up with sort of the initial ideas, and to make sure that they're looking at the right transparency metrics sort of to guide us in a healthy direction.
Probably take one more question, if there is one. Right here. Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm Sally-Ann from Gleek. I use machine learning to make us more human, and I do it through 5-minute interventions. I drop students into workplace situations and see how they practice human skills through a K-12 accredited system. Because the analytics that I get shows me exactly the patterns of the type of students from a really young age, and the types of jobs coming down in the future that need these human skills. So I'm purely looking at soft skills. And I have a lot of recruitment companies wanting that data, because already you have the recruitment, it's that big conversation about students not being ready, and they can see from the simulation, you can actually see a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, how they're performing. What are the ethics around all of that? Because for all of you in education, you're seeing the patterns of really interesting information, and you're actually seeing the conversation happening siloed outside, and you're holding data with these patterns. So I'm super curious about
Yeah,
how you feel about
I'll just say the ethics begin with transparency. If you are using someone's data, the ethics begin with making sure that they understand the use you're going to put it to and that they have permissioned it. I don't necessarily believe there's any right or wrong about the reuse of data to create value, but you're clearly wrong if you are monetizing or in other ways disseminating data, and the people who created that data for you haven't given you absolute permission to do it.
The other thing I'd say is that in all of our professions, there is a group or groups or commissions who are working on exactly these questions. So what I would do is find that group that's been most thoughtful for the longest time about appropriate use of data, whether it's the Department of Education or something else, because the guidance that they can give a lot of times is excellent and very helpful in figuring out where are the bright lines of yes and no, and what do you need to stay away from.
Yeah. The internal compliance group is drafting rules and the frameworks around that as we're building out technology and products at the first front. So it's a parallel process. Yeah.
All right, we're at time. Thank you all so much.